how much energy you use basically determines your quality of life. And first of all, investing massive amounts into energy production. But as we see those technologies develop from nuclear, having smaller, more easily containable reactors, more easily built, we'll also see the potential for solar panels that you just roll out and stick on a tractor and plug it in and it'll work. So the idea that I think in the end, the cycle probably ends in some decade or two or whatever it is with the upswing of all those technologies providing vast amounts of wealth to the world.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey there. Ever feel like the world is spinning out of control? Welcome to the New Rules with Alan Pentz. Forget the old playbook. It's toast. We're in a new game now, and this is Alan Pentz bringing you 25 years of experience from Capitol Hill to the forefront of business innovation. We're here to show you how to navigate this chaos with precision. Whether it's superpowers jockeying for dominance or inflation shaking things up, we'll help you play 4D chess while everyone else is stuck on checkers. Subscribe now and let's dive in together to master the new rules of the game.
All right. We are back, coming to you live from a basement in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and a sunny room in San Cugat, Spain. Welcome, Tanya. Good to see you.
Thanks, Alan. Good to see you too.
Yeah, it's sunny and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. What's that in Celsius? Quick.
Well, it's not 80 today, but I'm still studying. I'm still studying the
Celsius conversion.
The Celsius to Fahrenheit.
I can't do it. That's what
it's 32 plus 32 or something like that, but I can't tell you right off the bat.
All right, let's get started. What are we talking about this week, Tanya?
Oh my gosh, you have a lot to say. There's a lot to say. I think we were going to talk about the sleeper Awakens, I think was the latest topic, which of course has got to be piquing people's interest. I know it piqued mine.
Yeah. So just to be clear, I love Dune. I love the book. I love the current movies, even though it should have been a series, not just movies. But they did make a version with Kyle MacLachlan and David Lynch. They directed it in the 80s with Sting, actually, isn't it? I don't know if you remember that, which is really bad. It's campy and worth watching because it's interesting, but it's definitely a poorly acted movie. So I use this with reservations, but the idea here was that my sort of the whole point of the newsletter was that kind of the world that we grew up in and knew has been increasingly falling away over the last decade or two, and I started thinking about it as the end of a cycle, probably I would say a 40-year cycle, which is sort of spans from the closing part of the Cold War, with the election of Reagan, say, to, you can date it. Things started changing, you could say 9/11, but then some people would say the great financial crisis, or some people would say Trump's election or Brexit or something like that. But sort of somewhere in there, I might date it even, kind of somewhere around the combination of Trump's election plus the pandemic. But anyway, somewhere in that range, things really started shifting. And at first, it just seemed sort of chaotic to me, but I've spent some time reflecting on it. And basically, the newsletter is supposed to be, how do we find the new rules of where we are now? And to me, they're kind of the flip side of what was happening for that 40 years. So if we look at it, it was characterized by, the U.S. being predominant, right? So first kind of winning, surpassing the Soviets in the 80s, and then that country dissolving itself in the early 90s, and the U.S. kind of being preeminent globally for the couple of 3 decades after that. So that was one, and that led to, a real hyper globalization. So I think the U.S. had led an alliance of anti-communist or not aligned with communist states and built sort of a free trade zone amongst those. in order to bolster their economies. And that core, was pretty, not totally, but somewhat cut off from the Soviet bloc and their aligned countries. And then post Cold War, that all opened up. So now the United States has, extended that globalization zone to everyone. And particularly that helped the Chinese, who came on and grew significantly, multiples of their economy over a couple of decades. So that world was characterized by predominant U.S. power, hyper-globalization. As a result of those, we had falling inflation and interest rates from a peak of, I don't know, in 82, they were in the high teens, 20, something like that, under Paul Volcker, and then came down to almost zero, to zero or below zero in Europe, zero in the United States, really, before the pandemic. So those cycles kind of all were trending in one direction. And I'd also say there was a certain level of stability in the world. I mean, obviously there were wars and things happened.
Sure, but relatively speaking.
Yeah, and you have a hyperpower in the United States, and a globalized, hyper-globalized world is relatively stable. And so I think each one of those has been challenged over the last 5 to 10 years, right? So first, post-pandemic, we saw huge supply shocks with understanding that our supply chains were pretty fragile. They'd been built super complicated, intricate supply chains that were pretty delicate, actually. So we saw that breakdown, and some people blame the massive amounts of stimulus that were put out, particularly in the United States, in the pandemic for inflation. So I certainly think they made things worse.
Do you agree with that?
So yeah, I'd say it's like 20% of the story. I think 80% of the story is supply shocks from the pandemic, and so we had, like you couldn't get toilet paper, right? So all of a sudden,
oh God, I remember that.
That was bad, right? Cars, we didn't have chips, and so cars were hard to get, and so everything kind of went up in price.
It was a shock for people.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I don't think anybody thought we were that vulnerable, right? And I think we're still seeing the play out of that with the United States trying to reshore things like semiconductors and other key technologies. So I definitely think there was like this huge shock to the system. But at the same time, these are all intertwined, right? They're not separate influences. But we were also de-globalizing at the same time. And I actually think that shock made us de-globalize even faster, right? So already Trump had levied tariffs on China in 2017 or whatever it was, 2018. And, now the popularity of that with both parties has gone up and will continue to go up, I think. And so we're basically in the process of creating more inflationary conditions by deglobalizing. Now, I think we should deglobalize to a certain extent in that we can't rely on these intricate supply chains for everything. Nor can, I think the other thing that's a factor here is that China itself has doubled down on its manufacturing sector because it's going through a fundamental change where its real estate sector is deflating. It can't build any more infrastructure inside the country because they just have so much that's useless at this point. So now instead of allowing that excess capacity to go to serving the needs of their own consumers and their own people, they're really doubling down on advanced manufacturing sectors like solar, batteries, EVs. You're hearing all about that in Europe right now. And so they're basically distorting their economy to try to wipe out everybody else's advanced manufacturing capacity so that they become the only supplier of many of these things in the world. And so I think that, the EU and the United States and others have no choice but to deglobalize in the face of that. They just can't leave their markets open to a state that's willing to take all the money from its people and put it into subsidizing these sectors, or else we're going to be left with no capacity to build anything, right? And we're going to be even more vulnerable, as we saw in the pandemic. So I think those two things are happening. Deglobalization is continuing. It's not going to be all at once or one day, but it's certainly going to stoke inflation.
But it's a process. It's been happening.
Right. And I think we're facing a long period of time where we're going to have a lot of supply shocks from time to time because there'll be a war, there'll be some, tension that you just saw it with Israel and Biden said something about contemplating hitting an Iranian oil facility, and all of a sudden the price of oil spikes. Right. So we're going to see a lot of that kind of thing happening going forward, which we didn't really see very much of from the 80s on. And, but we did see that quite a bit in the 60s and 70s. We had these supply shock driven recessions. So I think we're going to see that. And then the other things I identified is, well, kind of keeping in that theme is just more, well, I'd say more like the instability is where I'd go next. And just saying that, with these supply shocks, with de-globalization, with inflation, we're just going to have a lot less stability. And I think that the United States in particular is going to have to spend more time prioritizing what it gets involved in and what it doesn't, and allowing for certain amounts of instability to exist with it doing nothing about it, because it's got to focus on other things that are more important. So I think that's going to mean a lot more instability across the world. And I just don't see any way that changes. And then, yeah, like you had mentioned, technology change. I think that's sort of these other things sound bad, I guess, And
Yeah, they sound scary, Alan.
Some ways they're bad. Some ways they're good. They're going to mean more jobs for higher paying, more manufacturing center jobs in the West. We're going to end that gutting of our sectors. So I think, there's going to be some positive effects of those three trends, although granted they are mostly negative. But I do think that the key, sort of the one shining jewel in all of it, is I do think the pace of technology change is going to accelerate. While all these sort of old world kind of problems reassert themselves, inflation, de-globalization, that deal with geography and things that you read about in history books, right? We're also going to see this incredible blossoming of technology. And I think we are on the verge. We're already entering the AI age, and that and other factors are going to drive huge productivity gains from AI. We're also going to, I think biogenetics and healthcare are just waiting for they're going to transform lifespan and how we live. I think robotics offer quite a transformation of manual labor and other things in our society. And I also think energy, as I've mentioned in other posts, I think how much energy you use basically determines your quality of life. And we are, first of all, investing massive amounts into energy production. But as we see those technologies develop, from nuclear, having smaller, more easily containable reactors, more easily built, we'll also see, we talked about, I think it was last week or the week before, about the potential for solar panels that you just roll out and stick on a tractor and plug it in and it'll work, that kind of stuff. So the idea that I think in the end, the cycle probably ends in some decade or two or whatever it is, with the upswing of all those technologies providing vast amounts of wealth to the world. So I think that's where we need to focus, is we've got to keep investing in these technologies and remove the barriers to implementing them.
And thinking about how we integrate them. That's a big question, right? Like, how do we integrate them?
And it takes years to integrate technologies like that. I see it every day with AI. We have it and some people use it, but most of the people in my company don't use it, right? Or don't use it for all that it can be used for. So that'll take years and long periods of time where AI is included in different pieces of software, and people realize, oh, I can do it this way and that way, and here are the workflows that it needs to have. And that takes a lot of iteration. And the same goes for, you can invent 1,000 cures for a disease, but you got to get it through the FDA process and or the equivalent in the EU, right? So you can have a lot of innovation, but it takes a long time for that innovation to diffuse through the economy. And so that's what I think we need to really focus on, is not killing that process. So avoiding things like the EU AI law. We just saw, actually, California, Governor Newsom for in a rare agreement I have with him, he vetoed their AI bill. So it will not be law. So I do think.
When did he do that, Alan?
That was last week, I believe. So that won't be the end of AI regulation. Nor do I think we should never regulate AI. I just don't think we know enough about AI. We haven't even seen it really applied all that much for us to go out and figure out how to regulate it. I think things like permitting reform are very important. I do think actually a hidden benefit of AI, I think, is going to be the power needs for these data centers to do what they call inference, which is when the AI is giving you an answer, are so high. They're exploding. I was actually just talking to a friend of mine who works in this, and these new models like ChatGPT came out with this O1 model that does reasoning. And so it doesn't give you one answer. It gives you all the stages of how it came up with the answer, and it can go back to other stages and rethink it. So the inference costs of that, the amount of electricity that uses, goes up like 10, 100 times, right? So that process of the need to stay at the forefront of AI is going to drive both political parties in the United States to allow a lot more electricity production, which I think leads to blowing away some of the permitting issues we have. And I think it's probably a pretty big break in the dike of environmental regulation in the United States, which...
Who do you think might do a better job at that?
To be honest, you could make an argument for either one. So you could say, all right, a Republican administration is going to go right at it and say, get rid of all this stuff, right? Get rid of these regulations. But then you have to say the entire environmental movement and potentially the Democratic Party in opposition would side against them and fight this out, right? Whereas you could say, so they might be able to win a victory, but it would be a costly victory. And then on the Democratic side, you could say, hey, look, these are your people trying to change it. And so they're more likely to be able to make changes without a huge amount of opposition. Or, it's going to be hard. The environmentalists then are fighting a rearguard action against their own party, which is going to be harder to win. And theoretically, all the Republicans would be on their side. So I don't know. You can make an argument for both. I just think once you get into these huge national security priorities, like caring about the, ex-butterfly or titmouse that lives somewhere near it is going to get a lot less important. And it's not like I say we shouldn't have any environmental regulation. It's just the level of regulation where you can't build something for 7 years, you're in a permitting process, is just ridiculous. I mean, this is just anti-growth nonsense. It's not there to protect the environment. It's there to keep people poor, because people think elements of the environmental movement believe that humans are like bad and having more humans is a terrible thing. To that, I say, screw you. You're anti-human. And yes, we need to preserve the...
You got to write about this too. This is going to be another one.
Yeah, they're anti-human. They're degrowth.
This one I know you're passionate about.
No, they're degrowth. They hate people. And maybe they wouldn't admit that, but that's essentially what their policy is. Because, we were all peasants scratching out our living in the dirt and, until the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution was about harnessing energy for, exponential gains. And until that point, you would have a time of abundance because the weather was good and you'd have more kids, and then they'd all starve to death when the weather turned. And so that's the world that they're supporting. And to that, I say, fuck you. I don't want that world. I do think that there's a place for environmental regulation, but it's become a sclerotic system that's just based on, now it's about not creating productivity. It's not about protecting the environment. And so there are trade-offs we can make. We have to make trade-offs there. And so, yes, we're going to have a little bit less environmental regulation, but we're going to have vastly increased wealth for everybody in the world, basically. And so I don't think a 7-year permitting process for, a gas state, a electrical grid upgrade or new power stations makes any sense in this world. And I think it will be blown through.
And why 7 years?
Yeah, the average, it's the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, this umbrella law that brings in sort of Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, all these state regulations. It depends on what permits you're looking at, but a report from a couple of years ago had the average permitting time as 7 years. And it's largely because you can delay. The environmental groups have gotten very sneaky about how to time lawsuits. And so they'll have like, say, eight things they can sue about, and they'll just sue on one, wait till the last day of that ruling, and then sue on the next one, wait till the last day of that, and so this system has just turned into this disaster. And you saw it in the IRA legislation where Joe Manchin was trying to get permit reform as a condition of supporting the bill. And that didn't work that time. He was given a fig leaf that, we'll deal with it in the next session, and they didn't do anything. But I do think once you have this, hey, you're going to lose the AI race to the Chinese, who, by the way, are building electricity at rates, 100 times what you're doing. And we haven't had real electricity growth in this country since the early 1970s. And once you hear that, I think the game's over. It's, you're talking about sacrificing leadership in the critical technology of the future that will determine how capable your economy and military are. I just don't see the environmental movement being able to block that. I mean, they're going to have to cave, or they'll just be run over. Again, I'm not saying we get rid of all environmental regulation. I'm just saying, like, we got to turn this into a streamlined system that recognizes some trade-offs, right? You can't just have pristine environment everywhere all the time. That's ridiculous. And we also have to think about, who are we doing this for? This is for humanity. I think there's been this sort of romantic degrowth kind of movement on the extreme left, and particularly in the green and environmental movements. I call it the Gretaverse. And it's sort of this emotional thing, like, hey, we want the world to be, humans have done all this evil, and we're destroying the earth, and we're overpopulating it. I mean, all these groups that are like, there was a big movement in the 70s and 80s against, thinking that we're going to overpopulate the earth. Of course, that did not happen. We're now shrinking, right, or about to. So anyway, that entire group of people has got to be dealt with. I mean, they have to go into the descent. They were kind of on the ascent, I think, from the 70s. Yeah, they were going up. They need to go down. So, and I think that AI is going to be the forcing function, to be honest, because it's so clearly based on energy production that it's kind of like two key things that people see as the limiters on AI development, and it's chips and energy. And actually, Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, basically said, he came out a few months ago, he's like, I think it's going to be energy. And that's why you see, like, it's in the press last week, Microsoft is now partnered, I think it's Constellation Energy, who owns the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant, which had the partial meltdown in the 80s or late 70s or whatever. They're going to it was being decommissioned, or it had been decommissioned. It was still operating after the accident. And they're going to turn it back on and use it for AI power. So it's a real priority, and I will write more. I need to write more about energy. I've been actually having some conversations with people about some of the key technologies and some of the limitations of them. And it'll be interesting. I mean, my take is we just can't rely on solar and wind. So that's not going to do it for AI. Like nuclear, this is my initial, I haven't finished all the research, but nuclear will be great. And but even if with permitting reform, it does take quite a long time to build it. Now, there are trends with different technologies now and small scale nuclear that you can deploy more easily, those kind of things. So I'll be talking about that a little bit. So those are part of it, but we do need to start a nuclear program again of building. And
I think talking about it is important, because people of our generation, it's like you hear nuclear, right? And you think Chernobyl. It's that psychological.
Yeah, almost nobody's ever died in a nuclear accident. So that's like ridiculous. And what happened in Chernobyl could never happen anywhere else.
No, of course, but people don't think about that because there's no talk about it.
And people worry about nuclear waste. And then you go hear a statistic like all the nuclear waste ever created in the United States fits in a swimming pool sized space that goes down 10 meters. That's it. The entire waste product, right? So we can contain that. That's doable. But I don't think it can just be nuclear, right? Because we can't build that fast enough. we certainly should not be decommissioning nuclear like they're doing in Germany. I mean, the insanity that's happening in Germany is, it's a theme of my newsletter. Yeah, so I think that's going to have to be a part of the long range thing. I think the reality is we're going to have to deal with natural gas for now because it's the fastest thing we can build. Solar cannot scale that fast. Batteries and solar, theoretically someday there's a possibility we could do that, but we're not there yet. And the other technology I've been looking at, actually talking to a friend of mine who's involved in the research on this, is geothermal as a long-term renewable source as well. Although it has problems with it, there's tons of energy at the core of the Earth. I think my friend was saying that the core of the Earth is hotter than the surface of the sun, which seems insane to me, but I guess that's true. But it's hard to access, right? So like if you're in Iceland and you have hot springs everywhere, the geothermal is pretty close to the surface with all the volcanic stuff. But some parts of the United States, it's like 10 miles, 12 miles down. So you'd have to drill through the earth, So anyway, there are technologies that potentially will be able to help with that. And long term, that might be one of the key solutions. And maybe solar will scale to be, but it's just it's always going to be intermittent. Yes, you can build massive battery technology to save power, but it does feel like it's going to take a while for solar to get there. And it might not ever get there. Who knows? And nuclear can do it. And we could build within 5 to 10 years, we could build enough nuclear to take care of these issues. So, and I think in the short term, we're going to have to build natural gas facilities. There's just no other way around it. It's the only thing we can build that fast. That's that reliable and abundant. Plus the United States we're swimming in the stuff. So it would kind of be crazy for us not to do it. So anyway, I will go more into that in another post. I'm not giving you all the caveats and things like that because I don't have them in front of me, but I'll do that in a couple of weeks or so. So enough about my rant on the environment.
I got you a little off track.
I like hiking. I like the mountains. I like all that stuff too. I think we can have that and have AI, right?
You like composting?
Yeah, I wanted the electric train in California, man. They've spent, I don't know, what is it, like 30, 40 billion dollars, and they have like 2 miles of track in the Central Valley because of just like endless environmental reviews. I mean, it's just, if you want to know, I mean, I did a piece on that a couple of years ago. I think I might republish that. Just go look at what the high-speed train in California, that project is, it will tell you everything that's wrong with building in this country. I mean, it is the biggest joke.
Is it a case study? Is it a perfect case study of it?
Oh my God. Just like every stupid environmental thing they could come up with, spending tens of billions on consultants and studies, and they're not building anything. They didn't build anything. The project was proposed in like 2010, 2011. I mean, we're like 14 years later. There's like a couple miles of track in the Central Valley.
Just the two.
Yeah, in California, because that's the only place where there's, not enough NIMBYism to, because nobody wants to live in the Central Valley. So, if they can build something there, but it doesn't connect any cities that you'd want to go to. I mean, it's not going to connect San Francisco to LA. And then they had to move the track way around all this stuff because no one wants this built there. It is insanity. You read that and you're like, this whole movement is fucked. Like, these people should all be taken out and shot. So
I bet you get into some really good at cocktail parties in DC, Alan. Do you get into some really good, interesting?
Yeah, Chevy Chase, Maryland, people love hearing stuff like that. But actually, even here, I think that people, like when you talk to them, they recognize there's a problem. They also want an abundant future. They're not the crazy, degrowth, anti-human, Gretaverse people. They want a reasonable environment. They like the outdoor. Everybody does, right? When you talk to them and they can and get them to a place where you're really talking about the facts, I think most people kind of agree. They might not use my inflammatory language because these people drive me crazy. But I think most people do agree.
Well, not everybody can get away with it.
And just to tie this up, I think the point I'm trying to make is what's in the title of this post, The Sleeper Awakens. I think a lot of us knew that these things are happening. And you get a sense, you see Brexit, you see Trump, you see that we can't build trains, you see this, and you're like, something's got to change, but I don't know what. And my take has been that we just had this long period of falling inflation, or hyper globalization that made everything cheaper, raised asset prices in the United States, and like the rich got a lot richer, and everyone got richer, but the rich got a lot richer, and for a long time. And the United States was preeminent, right? We did whatever, and we could go in and kick around Iraq for a few years and then be like, we don't want to do this anymore, and then walk away and have no consequences, right? And to us, to them, there were plenty of consequences, but same in Afghanistan, right? So we could just do all this stuff. And it's like, in some ways, that's a really good world for Americans and people in the West. Europe can run around and indulge in all these crazy green schemes and, I don't know, lower the retirement age to like -2. So you stop working before you're born. And, there's no consequence. And now the consequences you're starting to feel them, right? And there's this quote from the book I say in the, so the sleeper has awoken never is actually said in the book or in the new movie, just in the bad movie. So, but the father of the main character is talking about this world that they lived on, called Caladan, and how that, moving from Caladan is the whole impetus to the book that changes everything. Right. So, but he has this quote. He said, "We came from Caladan, a paradise world of our form of life. There existed no need on Caladan to build a physical paradise or a paradise of the mind. We could actually see it all around us. We could see the actuality all around us. And the price we paid was the price men have always paid for achieving a paradise in this life. We went soft. We lost our edge." And to me, this is sort of exactly what's happened during this 40-year period. And as the father says to the son before they move, he says something like, "Without change, something sleeps inside us and seldom awakens. The sleeper must awaken." So I do think that that's sort of what's happening here. It's like the sleeper's got to awake. We got to realize the world is a constrained world, and the U.S. isn't always going to be the predominant power, and you can't have crazy crazy hyperglobalization without costs to the people and brittle supply, overextended brittle supply chains. All these things are a cost, and the bill's starting to come due, and I think my newsletter is all an effort to try to figure out how to navigate that process. So that was sort of the conceit of the piece.
No, I that's why I think it's great to be talking about this stuff, because it's been a good ride for us, in the United States of America. Well, yeah, well, that's another whole, but it's been a good ride, right? And people don't think about energy in these terms. Like, you're framing it in a realistic way that people don't want to think about, because, it can be easy to be like, but the environment. I mean, we all love the environment. I love that you say that, right? Everybody loves the environment. That would be like saying, kittens are ugly.
Or strangling kittens the way the Europeans do. Right? Man, I'm not gonna. If this ever gets really popular, I'm gonna have to curtail my travels to Europe, which would be a real bummer. I don't want to be booed in the streets. I love Europe. I just think you guys are going down a path that's not sustainable. So
you're just keeping it real, Alan.
You are the heart of Caladan in Europe. So they're now awaking to the fact that the United States doesn't care that much about Europe, and Russia's going to be the problem they have to deal with, and energy actually matters. You can't just get rid of everything, all that kind of stuff. So
that was a lot to say, but you had some other things to say too.
Yeah, let's take on a less controversial topic: the Gaza, the Israel and the Gaza.
That won't ruffle feathers at all.
So actually, this is a good disclaimer. Like, I'm not here to make moral judgments about countries' actions, except in extreme cases. I'm trying to understand what's going on, right? And like, you have to kind of take a realist view of what's happening to get a full understanding. And if you allow, I think these people are bad and these people are good, you're going to end up not really understanding what's going to happen, because things aren't based on who's good and who's bad. Things are based on who has power, who has wealth, and who doesn't, who has constraints, and how bad are those constraints versus the other person, right? That the other entity or actor. So I think I'm a realist, and I think that this is the way I'm going to approach it, and I'm not going to give you some moral judgment about does Israel's invasion of Gaza are they good or bad for doing it? How many people they should kill for every terror? I'm not going to get into that stuff because like that's you make a decision. I'm just telling you why they're doing it and why others aren't reacting the way you think they would, right? Because I do think people are like, hey, Israel. Some people more on the left, right, are like, Israel's evil. Why are they going and killing all these kids in hospitals in Gaza? So that would lead everyone to condemn Israel, and Israel will be isolated and fall apart. That's sort of like maybe one of the narratives, right? And I'm like, well, if you really understood what was going on, you'd realize that this is part of a battle between overall in the Middle East, where there's a divide between Sunni and Shia countries, the two main versions of Islam, right? And so you have all these Arab Sunni states. It's also racial in some ways, right? The Arab Sunnis. And you have Persian Shias in Iran. And they all frickin' hate each other for 1,000 reasons. And Israel's like an ally with the Saudis and a lot of the Gulf states against the Iranians and Egypt, right? So they're not going to abandon Israel over a war with Gazans who they don't care about. They're going to say stuff in public, but you can hate what Israel's doing, but realize like it's part of this larger set piece happening in the Middle East that's been going on for, some of it goes back to the Iranian Revolution, some of it goes back to before the Bible was written, right? So I think I've got to cut through that, and I can't just engage in like moral judgments. I mean, I have my own moral judgments, which you probably could guess, but that's not what this is about. So anyway, that set aside. But I do think like a lot of people were shocked by the Gaza or by the Hamas attack into Israel, and like what the incredible intelligence failure that was for Mossad and the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. So these are legendary actors in the Middle East, right? And how did they not detect this? How did they not respond more quickly? They just seem to get caught completely flat-footed.
And you include a link for more reading on that too.
Yeah, if you want to take a look in the newsletter, yeah. So that was sort of the wonder, and as Israel invaded Gaza and basically leveled it, they're trying to make up for that. And at the same time, you saw, Iran has constructed, sort of what I think is going to happen in the long run is everything's about Iran going nuclear for now. That's sort of the narrative we're in. And they're worried that Israel, as the most capable power in the region, is going to blow up all their nuclear facilities the day they go nuclear, right? So what did they do? It's like, I'm going to build this army in Lebanon on your northern border. I'm going to fund Hamas on your southern border. And I've got some Houthis, that are down over here. And so they called it a ring of fire, right, around Israel. And so over time, they were building up rockets and funding these groups. And so what I think was in Israel's head is, yes, we're going to fight this war with Iran. That's the ultimate war we're all after. And to be honest, the Saudis and Egyptians and many others think that that's what's going to happen too, because they're locked in this struggle. And I think when the Mossad or the Israeli elites looked at the situation, the northern border was the real problem. Hamas was a lot more sophisticated, capable, and they got like real rockets because they controlled real territory, right? They control the government in Lebanon mostly. And they were able to put in like missiles that would make Israel unlivable, right? The amount of stuff they could launch. They're also a much more capable army. And to be honest, Hezbollah is a Shia group, which is aligned with Shia Iran. Then you go down to Gaza, you got this small, poor little place with not that many people. They are also Sunnis, right? So the people in Iran who are backing Hamas, these people were dogs that were like worthy of just being thrown and killed in front of cannon. They were cannon fodder because these Sunnis and Shias hate each other, right? So it's a very odd alliance, but it was an alliance of convenience. And because of Israel's traditional hold in Gaza and networks and stuff like that, they were never going to be able to build the level of capability, nor would they want a bunch of Sunnis necessarily having it in Gaza. So as a result, I think Israel always looked at Hezbollah as the real threat. And Hamas was like, they're a pain in the ass, but they can't really do that much. I mean, they're building tunnels and they're smuggling, and they can launch a few rockets, low capability. They can be a nuisance, but the real threat was Hezbollah in the north. And so I think that the shock. So as a result, they spent much more of their resources, scenarios, and intelligence on the north border and Hezbollah. And so when that left an opening for Hamas to commit this terrorist attack. And right, as horrific as that terrorist attack was, they killed like 1,200 people or something like that. That would not, they could do that one time, right? And that did not make Israel unlivable. It's certainly horrific and terrifying and all those sorts of things, but it is not existential to the state of Israel. So I think that we probably overrated the significance of the attack. It's somewhat understandable that it's still kind of inexcusable that the intelligence services were more focused on the north and the south. And I think the whole game for Israel this whole time was about getting Gaza taken care of so they could hit the north, where they're actually worried long term about the results about the attack from Hezbollah. So I also think they're taking advantage of the fact that we have a president who might not be at the top of his game and an election going on. So, Kamala Harris doesn't necessarily want to come out condemning Israel right now. And so there's a little brief window here where they can kind of reset the game. And I think we've now seen in the last couple of months just a complete reversal of the situation that existed before. I mean, first they bomb the Hezbollah's military head in Tehran itself, blow up his apartment. He's dead. Then they go launch this pager attack in southern Lebanon where they take out all the they wound thousands of their people, kill a bunch of them. There was walkie-talkies the next day. So they infiltrated their supply chain.
That was devastating for their leadership.
And then they couldn't talk to each other, right? So then they've been tracking Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, and he obviously is reluctant to get together with everyone to talk, although they now can't communicate. They can't coordinate action. So my understanding of it is they thought that Netanyahu flew to the UN meeting just last week when this attack happened. And they thought there's no way Netanyahu's launching an attack while he's in New York hanging out with the Americans, because the Americans get all mad about it. That's exactly what they did. So Nasrallah thought, hey, I can have this meeting. I can bring people together so we can coordinate, figure out how to respond and get back on our feet. And of course, Israel takes that opportunity to sink these bunker busters into them and decapitate the entire movement. And this is all a prelude to moving into southern Lebanon, which they're now currently doing cross-border raids. They haven't fully invaded, but they're going to try to wipe out as much of Hezbollah capability as possible. I don't think they're ever going to be able to take out Hezbollah totally. I mean, Iran will still fund it. And then Iran launches this sort of ridiculous attack of missiles that all of them get knocked down. And I think we've seen, I called it like within a few, I mean, it's been a year because Gaza was part of it, but within a few months, it's like Michael Corleone in the Godfather, where he baptizes his son and then his people are out and they kill every single one of his enemies at the same time. And it kind of felt like Israel was doing that. It's like, hey, we've got this window and we knew the North was a bigger threat. Everything was perfect. They did it. They decapitated all of their immediate enemies. And then Iran shows that it doesn't really have that much capability to strike back now that Israel's decapitated the Ring of Fire. And now we'll see what happens. I mean, I will be very interested if they feel they can press the advantage and actually take Iran somehow, like really put Iran back on its heels. And the reality is here, Iran is the government is very weak. The economy is terrible. Iran is full of what we don't think of it this way, but Iran has all these national minorities, like other peoples within it. So it's something like 60% of the people are actually Persian. 40% are minorities, and I might have that figure wrong, so I'll correct it if I do. And the economy's bad. The people are not happy with the government. And so like they're in a very weak place.
And leadership is always relatively unstable in Iran, right? There's always somebody's getting killed. Somebody.
Other times I think they've had more, like it's always been unstable, but maybe the Revolutionary Guards and security services had more control. It does seem, you do get a sense that it's not. Now, I would say I'm probably suspicious of the ability to actually fundamentally knock Iran back to, get their nuclear program destroyed, their oil production capability, and not have a huge amount of consequences. But it does feel like Israel's changed the game. And the United States has always wanted kind of a balance in the Middle East. They don't really want to get involved. They just don't want anybody else to control it. This might be a fundamental balance of power shift. I mean, it certainly is. Like the fact that the Ring of Fire has been decapitated, I think is a huge balance of power shift. Now, if they press the advantage, I think the stakes go way up at this point. And I'm like big question mark on where this goes and what I would say you should do. I don't know. I mean, I think if you're an Israeli, you're like, hey, we could permanently or like long-term disable Iran right now. They're so weak. Maybe I take that shot. But like, how long is it going to take Iran to get a nuclear weapon? And if the regime feels like it's under threat, if it could do it in a few months, maybe you're dealing with a nuclear situation. So,
and you just said it, the largest shift, something has shifted greatly, right? It's like the largest shift in a generation or something.
Yeah. I mean, certainly since the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, and maybe even before that. I think this is one of the things to really look as a new role, like really trying to understand how taking a realistic look without emotion at what the capabilities and constraints of these different players, how that's going to play out. Because I do think you see a world in which the U.S. isn't preeminent anymore. There are a bunch of smaller players like China and Russia, but they don't really project power into the Middle East. They don't have, China can provide a lot of money and some capability, but they don't really have a big blue water navy that can go into the Middle East and do something. So there is a little bit of a power, and we don't want to spend resources in mind. We make our own oil and gas. Like we don't need their shit. We just don't want anybody else to dominate it. Like we don't want China to take it over, right? There's a vacuum. And the Israelis are making the move. And this is the way these things are going to play out in the future. And now the U.S. will have a very core interest in East Asia with China. But I think in the Middle East, we have less of an interest. We want sort of balance. If we can't have balance, maybe we want Israel and Saudi running. Well, I don't know. But we just don't want China doing it. And I think we're not going to spend that much blood and treasure trying to prevent what's happening from happening. And I think the Israelis know it. And that's what's happening.
It's fascinating. It's heavy. It's a lot to understand. I mean, I want to say, is there a primer out there for the average, American?
Yeah. I was thinking about doing a video that did like the main, just like trying to help people understand. I mean, you got to cut it off somewhere because you can go back to like biblical times if you want. But trying to help people understand these actors and why they're reacting like they do. And
right. But most people don't know Sunnis from a Shia, from a, Hamas, Hezbollah. I mean, it's a lot for the average person but it has a lot of consequence.
But I think this is an example of like how quickly something can change. Because all the stuff that people didn't, we've been spending years telling Israel to back off, don't do this, don't. And they just did it. And one terror attack, and actually the person who lost the most here, at least as of now, is this Sinwar guy who's now the military, he's the commander in Gaza he launched the attacks and he's surrounded by these hostages. He was a leader in Gaza of Hamas and is still there. I think largely still alive because he has the remaining hostages around him. I think the Israelis know exactly where he is. And he launched this thinking that Iran would get in, it would launch a bigger war, and they would finally get Israel or something, some version of that. That's sort of the theory of what he was doing. Very astute, by the way, very intelligent guy who understood the power of the hostages in Israel and understood the fecklessness of the United States. Well, I wouldn't say feckless. I would say the United States doesn't have the same interests that Israel has. That's the reality. We don't really care who runs the Middle East, as I said, as long as it's not China or Russia or some big power that we can't. Because oil is still important to everybody else. It might not be important to us, but it's still the most important commodity globally. So we don't want anyone controlling it. So anyway, that said, Sinwar understood how effective this attack would be and the response it would get. Now, I think he thought Israel was much less capable than it is. And I think in the end, it's now he created the opportunity, because there's no way Israel could have launched these attacks without the original Gaza, Hamas attack. And he's now created a situation where Israel might have set back their cause by at least a generation, if not more. And there's a little irony in that, right? And for that to have been launched by a Sunni, who the Iranians think are a bunch of dogs that are, cannon fodder, is the ultimate irony, right? I mean, their entire strategy was upset by a guy that they were giving money to that they think is dirt. And now their whole thing has collapsed. So we'll see how it plays out. I mean, it's certainly not done. But Iran's pathetic attack the other day, they launched 200 missiles and they all get shot down, and one lands and kills a Bedouin or something like that. It's what? You have no capability. And there was some quotes from sources close to the Republican Guard that were what the fuck are these guys doing? We don't have an air force. We cannot fight these guys. We will be ruined. You're talking potential regime change. Now, I think the U.S. would do whatever it had to do to stop that, because the instability of Iran's government being overthrown. You could have just all out war in Iran. They only have 60% of the population or whatever it is. That's aligned, and even those guys hate and there's some nuclear capability running around there. So that, I think the United States would throw their body in front of the train and say, hey, you can maybe hurt their gas supply, their oil supplies, or their oil exporting capability. Maybe you can hit their nuclear facility, but you cannot topple the government. But the reality is, if Israel chose to, I think they could probably topple the government in Iran in a week. So it's a huge shift in the balance of power. And I think it's exactly how things are going to play out in the future. You have to just look at the game board and what capabilities each person on it has and what their constraints are. And you will be able to figure out what will happen, because the United States just isn't going to impose its will the same way it did. It's not worth it to us. And there's no other capable power. No one else can either.
My takeaway is don't underestimate the Israelis.
No, you do so at your peril. Can you imagine those guys? You got your beeper blows up, then your walkie-talkie blows up, and you got to be sitting in Tehran going what do I touch? Everything could be booby-trapped by the Israelis. They are pretty good at their own terrorism, right? So I think it's been effective. So we'll see how it plays out. They made some chess moves that we haven't seen the like of in decades. And I think that that's going to be this is a guidebook to the new rules to me on the military conflict side. So cool. It's good to catch up. Enjoy the weekend in beautiful Sant Cugat.
I shall. And you enjoy the basement.
All right. See ya.
You've been listening to The New Rules with Alan Pentz. For more insights on mastering the new game, follow at Pentz, that's APENTZ, on X, and make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, in today's world, you don't follow the rules, you write them.